Hi there, my name is Lisa, and today we are going to be discussing how to fix two very common sewing machine issues that you might face on your next project. Let's get started. The first thing I'd like to talk with you about today is thread tension on your sewing machine. Now, you may have noticed that your sewing machine has two main thread sources. It has an uppermost thread spool that is sitting on top of your machine, and then you also have a secondary thread source called the bobbin. That uppermost thread has a tension adjustment on the front of your sewing machine. Sometimes it looks like a little dial, sometimes it looks like a slider bar. Either way, it runs from 0 to usually about 9. That uppermost thread tension not only shows up on that topmost thread that you're adjusting, but it also adjusts the bobbin thread as well. Let's take a look at some different tension settings and see how it shows up on your sewing. The first sample that I'm going to show you is a tension setting of 8 on my machine. What we're looking for, of course, when we're sewing is a nice, clearly defined stitch on both the topmost and the bottommost threads. When we're talking about machine tension, our ultimate goal is to have clearly defined stitches on both the top and the bottom of our work so that our seams are strong and even. They don't pull apart easily, and they're going to stay together when we wear our garments or when we use our bags or whatever else we're sewing. Let's take a look at this example that I have in front of us. For this example, my machine is set for a tension level of 8, which is a very tight tension. So I have a T up here and the number 8. Let's take a look at how that looks on this sample. The topmost thread on this sample, you can see, is almost a straight line. You can hardly see any bumps and valleys of the individual stitches. This is not going to produce a very strong seam because this top thread is almost just running flat against the surface of this piece of fabric. Let's take a look at the bobbin thread now by flipping the work over. So again, this is a tension 8 on my machine. The bobbin thread looks great. Very clearly defined bumps and valleys of each of those stitches. But again, because that top thread is just running along the top surface of this piece of fabric, it's not going to be as strong as if both of those top and bottom threads were evenly worked against each other. Now let's take a look at the opposite problem. My tension is set very loose on this second example. So I've got an L, and this is a tension setting of 0 or just a little bit over 0, not quite to 1 on my machine. Take a look at the top threads. The stitches are clearly defined. It looks great. But now let's take a look at the bottom part, the bottom thread. Oh no, this is terrible. Take a look. I've got bird's nests, I've got bunching, and the bobbin thread is just hanging out. Again, like on the other example, it's the opposite problem though. My top stitch was looking great with bumps and valleys of individual stitches, but here my bobbin thread is bunched up in places. It's completely loose, and when it is going along the top of the fabric, it is just simply sitting on top of the fabric. I could pull this out very easily. This kind of stitching is going to produce a very poor seam. It's not going to stay together. As a matter of fact, you could pull this apart and see gaps in the stitching. It's going to be terrible. So this is the exact opposite problem. This would be an example of what my stitching would look like if my tension setting was too loose. So I would need a tighter number or a higher number. Let's take a look one more time now at this sample on what a proper tension would be for this particular fabric. So take a look. The top stitching, oh, it's beautiful. I see peaks and valleys of the individual stitches here. Taking a look at the bottom side. Again, I see individual stitches, peaks and valleys. This is a proper tension setting for this particular fabric, and it's going to produce the tightest, most strong, best looking seams for my work. On my machine, this tension setting happens to be a 5, a little bit over a 5. Looking at one more example, I want to show you the differences, just making a little bit of adjustment on my tension setting. So I'm going to be turning my dial a little bit tighter each time. So I'm going to start with a relatively loose setting and work up. Now, taking a look here, that looks actually pretty good on that number 1 setting. But looking at the back, oh no, my tension is off. I can see on the back because I have very little definition in those bottom bobbin stitches. As I work my way across now, I'm going to see very clearly defined stitches on the top, but as I tighten that tension setting, my stitches are going to be less clearly defined. But that's okay, because look what's going to happen on the bobbin. So here I've got very clearly defined, so a very, very loose setting versus very clearly defined here. And now look at the bobbin side. So almost no delineation of stitches here versus a very nice even stitching here. So peaks and valleys, peaks and valleys, peaks and valleys. When I turn this over, peaks and valleys, peaks and valleys. This is going to be the best setting I have for my machine for this particular fabric, which is about a 6 on this setting. When you have your tension set properly for your machine, not only is it going to be easier to sew, your stitches are going to stay together, your seams are going to stay together beautifully. It's going to provide a long-lasting seam for your garment work. And of course, it will look beautiful. The second thing I'd like to talk with you today about is your needle selection for your sewing machine. Choosing the right needle for your work will make your results so much easier to sew and so much cleaner and more professional looking. Let's take a look at some different choices and what you need to know about your needle selection. The first thing you need to know about needles is they come in 2 points, a regular point and a ball point needle. These are for 2 different types of fabric weaves. Let's talk about that for just a quick second. So the weave of a fabric, you can have a standard weave, woven fabric, or you might have a knit fabric. Those 2 different types of fabric are going to require you to have a different type of needle. A regular point needle, like the ones in this pack, actually come to a straight point and they pierce the individual fibers of the fabric. This is for all of your fabrics that are regular woven types of fabrics, like say this dress shirt material. This dress shirt material is a woven fabric, and this is true of most of your cottons, what I'm wearing today, what's on my dress form. All of these are woven type fabrics. They have very little stretch in either the weft or the weave. They do have some stretch on the bias, on the diagonal. So for this type of woven fabric, you're going to use a regular point needle. Now this pack is brand new, so it's a little harder to read. This pack, I've used some of the needles out so you can see these little numbers. And we're going to talk about those numbers here in just a second. The second type of needle that you will encounter that you need to know about is called a ball point needle. And always they will be somewhere on the packaging, the words ball point needle. Ball point needles are used for knitted fabrics. The tip of this ball point needle is actually a little ball at the end. So instead of piercing the individual fibers as you're sewing, the ball serves as a kind of guide to shove the fibers apart. And so the sewing that you're going to be doing is going to be sewing in between the fibers. That's very important because when we sew in between that fibers, we allow that knit to retain its stretchy quality, which is why we sew why we like to wear knits. They're very comfortable. They drape nicely, and they're soft to the touch. This shirt that I'm showing you here is a knit fabric. Looking closely, you can see some individual stitches that almost look like little V's. Now, there are different types of knit. There are microfiber knits where you would almost need a magnifying glass to see the individual knits. My beginner sewers probably don't need to worry so much about that. General sewing, I'm going to be looking for, is it a woven fabric or is it a knit? If it's a woven fabric, I'm going to use a regular point needle. And if it's any kind of knit fabric, even a jersey knit that has stretch in all directions, in other words, it can stretch along the weft, it can stretch along the weave, and it also has stretch along the bias. So this is an example of a knit fabric. Using the right needle is very important. We want on our knit fabrics to maintain that stretchy quality. So not only will we change the setting on our sewing machine to a knit type of stitch, which will kind of look like a zigzag but in multiple points, but we're also going to use that ballpoint needle so that that needle will move the fibers out of the way and sew in between. The last thing we want to have happen was when we put on a piece of knitwear to have stitches start popping as we're putting it on. Oh, that's terrible. Then we're going to have to go back and re-sew. So we'll make sure that we use a ballpoint needle for our knit fabrics and a regular point needle for our woven fabrics. The next thing I want you to notice about the needles is that there are numbers on each of the needles. So not only do we have to worry about the point of the needle, we need to be concerned with the number. Now the numbers on the needles, you'll notice that there are two different numbers. There's a top uppermost number, which is on this pack of needles ranging anywhere from 80 to 100. And the second number ranges anywhere from 11 to 16 on this package of needles. And these are just, they're called universal, so they're going to be a regular point needle, basically an all-purpose needle. But the numbers ranging from 80 to 100 and 11 to 16. The 80 to 100 numbers is the European standard. And the 11 to the 16 is just the American standard. You'll see this on all different types of needles, and just know that those are different European and American standards. What you need to be able to recognize about these different standards is that the lower numbers, in other words, the 80, the 11s, that's going to be for your lighter weight fabrics. So, and there are even actually lower than just the 80-11. There's actually all the way down to 60/9 size needles. And those are going to be for your very, very lightweight woven fabrics like your chiffon or your very delicate lace or your tulle or very sheer fabric. As we work our way up on the needle size, these are going to be for our more heavyweight knit fabrics, all the way up to a 106 or 16 or tightly woven knit fabrics. So we're thinking about the density of the fabric that we're sewing now. So the density meaning how tight is the weave. The blouse that I'm wearing right here is a very lightweight or lightly woven fabric. I could get away with a 70-10 on this fabric, or even probably a 69. It's a very lightweight woven fabric. However, if I'm going to be sewing any kind of denim or corduroy or duct fabric, I am going to want a more heavy duty needle. And I'm going to be maybe even going farther than the 116 here. These are, like I said, universal needles. So this pack, while it has several different sizes, 3 different sizes in this pack, this will be good for most any application that I'm going to be sewing. I also have in my possession some heavyweight needles that I use for sewing canvas or heavyweight duct fabric that's tightly woven, or heavyweight wool fabric. I also have some different sizes for that. The 2 things that you need to be concerned about when choosing a needle for your sewing machine are the weave of the fabric. Is it a woven fabric or is it a knit fabric? And the second thing you need to be concerned with is the density of that fabric. How tight is the weave, or how tight is the knit? So the tighter the weave or the tighter the knit, the higher the number of the needle. So Don't necessarily worry about, is it a 90-14 or is it 116? Don't worry so much about the American versus the European standard, but the higher the number, the better suited for a more tightly woven fabric or a more tightly knit fabric. So that's all I have for you today. So we've talked about 2 common issues that you might have with your sewing and how to fix them. If you feel like you've missed anything, please feel free to rewind and rewatch this video as many times as you'd like. To dive even further into sewing and making your sewing the best it could possibly be, feel free to hop on to a live class, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.